The little paper ticket was already crumpled in the old man's trembling hand when the woman in the tailored black suit stepped in front of him and quietly took cue number 7 from his fingers. What happened next made an entire government office fall silent, because the billionaire everyone feared suddenly dropped to her knees in front of a stranger and began to cry. Nobody in that crowded daytime waiting room understood why a number as ordinary as 7 could break a woman who had everything money could buy. But by the end of that afternoon, they would learn that sometimes the smallest number can carry the weight of an entire lifetime. If you believe in kindness, forgiveness, hope, and second chances, please take a moment to like this story, share it with someone who needs hope today, leave a meaningful comment, and subscribe to our channel so our community can continue sharing stories that remind us what truly matters. The woman was named Elowen Hart, a 42-year-old technology billionaire whose face appeared regularly on business magazines and television interviews. She had built a software company from a tiny rented office into a global corporation, becoming known for ruthless negotiations, impossible standards, and a life so carefully controlled that almost nobody knew what happened behind the polished walls of her private world. That morning, however, Elowen was not entering a boardroom. She was standing inside the county social services building in a long line of tired people waiting to renew benefits, resolve housing problems, replace identification documents, and ask for help they had nowhere else to find. Elowen had come because of an inheritance dispute involving a small property that had once belonged to her late father, and she had expected to spend 20 minutes there before returning to her company. Then she noticed the old man sitting alone beside the window. His name was Arthur Bellamy. He was 74, thin beneath a faded brown jacket, with silver hair that looked as though it had been combed carefully that morning. His shoes were worn, his hands were rough, and his eyes carried the exhausted patience of someone who had learned not to expect the world to notice him. When his number was called, Arthur slowly stood, walked toward the counter, and realized he had dropped his ticket. Before he could bend down, Elowen picked it up. The paper read cue number 7. She handed it back without much thought, but Arthur looked at her for a long moment as though he had seen something familiar. Elowen was accustomed to people recognizing her, staring at her expensive clothes, or trying to calculate how much she was worth. Arthur did none of those things. He simply thanked her and returned to his chair. A few minutes later, a clerk announced that several numbers had been called incorrectly and that everyone affected would need to take a new ticket. Frustration spread across the room. People groaned, some argued, and one exhausted mother began crying because she had already missed work to be there. Elowen immediately stepped toward the counter, irritated by the delay. She was used to solving problems by demanding action. But before she could say anything, Arthur gently placed his hand on her arm. It was a surprisingly confident gesture from someone who looked so fragile. He pointed toward the crying mother, then toward the crowded room, quietly reminding Elowen that everyone there had a problem that mattered to them. Something about that simple gesture unsettled her. She pulled away and asked why he cared so much about strangers. Arthur smiled sadly and explained that many years ago, somebody had cared about him when nobody else did. He said he had promised himself he would spend whatever years remained making sure other people did not feel completely invisible. Elowen wanted to dismiss the sentiment, but she couldn't. Instead, she sat beside him. Arthur told her he had come to the building to ask about housing assistance. He had been living in a small rented room for nearly 3 years after losing his home following medical debt and a failed attempt to help his daughter. His daughter, Maribel, had struggled with addiction for years, and Arthur had spent almost everything he had trying to save her. He had succeeded in one sense because she was now sober, employed, and raising a little boy. But in the process, Arthur had lost almost everything himself. He never complained about it. He only said that sometimes a parent had to become poor so their child could become rich in something money could never measure. Elowen listened quietly. She didn't tell him that her own relationship with her father had ended 20 years earlier with anger so intense that she had never spoken to him again. Her father had been a brilliant engineer who believed Elowen should become something practical, stable, and respectable. Elowen had believed he simply didn't believe in her. She had left home at 22, built her company, and eventually became wealthy enough that she no longer needed anyone's approval. When her father died, she didn't attend the funeral. Then Arthur looked at her again and asked whether she had ever regretted walking away from someone. The question struck harder than he could have known. Elowen stared at the floor. For years she had told herself that leaving her father behind had been strength. She had convinced herself that successful people did not look backward. Yet there had always been one memory she could never erase, her father standing at the front door on the morning she left, holding a small paper ticket in his hand. It had been Q number 7 from a local employment office. He had given it to her because he had waited for hours to speak with an advisor about finding extra work to help pay for her college tuition. She had been angry and embarrassed by his sacrifice. She had refused the ticket and walked away. She had never seen it again. Until that morning. Arthur reached inside his old jacket and pulled out a small plastic sleeve containing a faded photograph. He showed it to Elowen without knowing why the image made her face suddenly lose all color. The photograph showed a younger man standing outside an employment office more than 2 decades earlier. Beside him stood a young woman with long dark hair and furious eyes. The woman was Elowen. Her breathing stopped. The young man was her father. Arthur explained that he had worked at that employment office as a maintenance worker. On the morning the photograph was taken, Elowen's father had been waiting in queue number 7. Arthur had noticed him struggling with paperwork and helped him fill out the forms. He had also seen Elowen storm away. Her father had watched her leave and then sat down on the curb with tears in his eyes. Arthur remembered him because that man had returned every week for months, taking whatever temporary work he could find so his daughter could stay in college. Elowen couldn't speak. She asked why Arthur had the photograph. Arthur explained that after her father got a permanent engineering job, he never forgot the maintenance worker who had helped him. They became friends. Years later, when Arthur's wife died, Elowen's father had quietly helped him pay his rent. He never told anyone because he didn't want gratitude. He simply believed that if somebody had helped him when he was standing in queue number 7, then he should help someone else when their turn came. Elowen's entire understanding of her childhood began collapsing. She had believed her father didn't care about her dreams. The truth was that he had sacrificed almost everything for them. She had believed he was ashamed of being poor. The truth was that he had worked extra shifts so she wouldn't have to be. She had believed he never understood her. The truth was that he had understood her so well that he had spent years quietly protecting the future she wanted. And Arthur had witnessed it all. Elowen asked him why her father never told her. Arthur looked toward the window and explained that pride could be a strange thing. Her father had never wanted his daughter to feel responsible for his sacrifices. He wanted her to believe she had earned her success herself. The only thing he had ever asked Arthur to do was keep one photograph safe, because someday, if Elowen ever came back, he wanted her to know that leaving home had not meant leaving his love behind. Arthur reached into his pocket again. This time he pulled out a small envelope. Elowen recognized the handwriting immediately. Her father's. Inside was a short letter written years before his death. He had written that he knew Elowen might never forgive him for the arguments they had shared, but he hoped one day she would understand that parents sometimes make mistakes while trying desperately to protect the people they love. He wrote that he was proud of her, not because she had become wealthy, but because she had remained stubborn enough to chase a dream nobody else could see. He ended the letter by saying that if she ever wondered whether he had loved her, she should remember one thing: he had never stopped waiting for her. Elowen folded the letter against her chest. For the first time in 20 years, the billionaire who had negotiated billion-dollar deals without blinking was crying in a government waiting room. Arthur gently placed his hand over hers. She apologized for everything. Not only to her father, but to the younger version of herself who had spent 2 decades believing she had been abandoned. She apologized for confusing silence with indifference. She apologized for measuring love in words when her father had expressed his through sacrifice. Most of all, she apologized for never asking one more question before walking away. Arthur told her that forgiveness did not change the past. It simply stopped the past from controlling the future. That sentence stayed with her. When Arthur's number was finally called, Elowen followed him to the counter. The clerk explained that Arthur qualified for emergency housing assistance, but there was a waiting period before a permanent placement could become available. Arthur nodded calmly, prepared to return to his tiny rented room. Elowen didn't interfere by throwing money at the problem. Instead, she asked the clerk what the system needed. She learned that several elderly applicants were waiting months because they lacked transportation, documentation, or advocates who could help them navigate the process. She realized that wealth had taught her how to solve individual problems while compassion was teaching her how to recognize broken systems. That afternoon, she made a decision that surprised everyone who knew her. She established a foundation dedicated to helping elderly people facing homelessness, medical debt, and family separation. But she gave the foundation no family name, no billionaire branding, and no publicity campaign. She called it Q7. Arthur became its first volunteer advisor. For months afterward, Elowen visited him every Friday during the daytime. She sat beside him in community centers, listened to elderly men and women describe problems nobody else had time to hear, and learned that dignity could not be purchased with a check. Arthur taught her patience. Elowen taught him that accepting help was not weakness. Eventually, Arthur was offered a permanent apartment through the Foundation's first housing initiative. On moving day, Elowen arrived carrying a box of groceries. Arthur protested that he could carry it himself, but she insisted. They laughed as they walked toward the building together. Inside the apartment, Arthur placed the old photograph in a simple wooden frame and set it on the mantel. Elowen stood beside it. For the first time, she didn't feel angry when she looked at her father. She felt grateful. Years later, people would talk about Q7 as one of the most successful charitable programs in the country. Thousands of elderly people found housing through it. Families received emergency assistance. Parents received transportation to medical appointments. Children who might have lost their homes stayed with their families. But Elowen always said the foundation had never really been her idea. It belonged to an old man who once waited in a government office with a crumpled ticket in his hand. Arthur eventually became a beloved figure at the foundation. He remembered everyone's name. He kept handwritten notes about birthdays, appointments, grandchildren, and favorite foods. He treated every person who entered the building as though they were important, because to him, they were. One bright afternoon, many years after that first encounter, Elowen walked into the Foundation's main office and found Arthur sitting near the entrance. He was older now, his hands weaker, but his smile remained the same. On the wall behind him hung a framed copy of the original ticket. Q number 7. Elowen sat beside him. Neither needed to say much. She had finally understood what her father had tried to teach her without ever finding the right words. Success was not how many people knew your name. It was how many people felt less alone because you had crossed their path. Arthur had spent his life helping people move forward in line. Her father had spent his life moving her forward. And now Elowen had finally realized that the greatest inheritance she had ever received was not money, property, or a company. It was the chance to continue their kindness. Before the story ends, I want you to leave a meaningful comment. If you were given one opportunity to go back and say something to someone you lost or walked away from, what would you say? Sometimes the words we postpone become the words our hearts carry forever. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, leave a meaningful comment, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another emotional journey. Because sometimes life gives us a second chance disguised as an ordinary moment, an ordinary person, or even a tiny piece of paper marked with an ordinary number. And sometimes, when we finally understand what that number means, we realize we were never waiting in a queue at all. We were waiting for forgiveness. We were waiting for courage. We were waiting to understand that love had been standing beside us the entire time. And sometimes, all it takes is one person in queue number 7 to remind us that it is never too late to become the person someone else has been waiting for.